What happens when the untouchable ice queen of the corporate world ends up drunk, vulnerable and completely at your mercy on a stormy night, and the next morning she is standing outside your apartment building dressed to kill but unable to meet your eyes because she remembers everything that happened between you two last night, and now the line between boss and employee, between power and vulnerability, between what should be and what could be, is about to be crossed forever because Derek Walsh, a man who has always lived in the shadows, is about to discover that sometimes saving someone means losing yourself. And sometimes the most dangerous storms are not the ones that rage outside, but the ones that brew in the space between two. People who should never have met but cannot seem to stay apart. Derek Walsh had never been the kind of man who believed in fate or destiny or any of that romantic nonsense that people sold themselves to make sense of their ordinary lives, because Derek understood something fundamental about existence, which was that some people were born to shine under spotlights, while others like him were meant to operate in the margins, keeping the machinery running, while others took the credit. And he had made peace with that reality years ago, when he realized that no amount of hard work or dedication would ever bridge the gap between people like him and people like her. Her being Elizabeth Hartley, the kind of woman whose very presence seemed to bend reality around her, creating a gravitational field that pulled everyone into her orbit, whether they wanted to be there or not. And Derek had spent 3 years working under her management at Hartley Global Enterprises, watching from his cubicle as she moved through the office like a force of nature, making decisions that affected hundreds of lives, with the casual ease of someone choosing what to have for breakfast. And he had told himself repeatedly that whatever fascination he felt was purely professional admiration, nothing more, because anything else would be absurd, given the canyon of difference between their worlds. But the universe apparently had a cruel sense of humor, because on a Tuesday evening in late October, when the sky had opened up with the kind of rain that felt personal, that felt like nature itself, was angry about something, Derek found himself face to face with Elizabeth Hartley in a way he had never imagined possible. And the circumstances were so far removed from the polished professional encounters he was used to that at first he did not even recognize her. He had been walking home from the office later than usual because he had stayed behind to finish a report that technically was not his responsibility, but he had learned long ago that being indispensable meant doing the work that others would not. And the storm had caught him halfway between the office building and his apartment complex, turning the streets into rivers, and the air into a wall of water that made it almost impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. And he was considering ducking into a doorway to wait it out when he heard it, a sound that should not have existed in the chaos of the storm, a high-pitched cry that cut through the thunder and rain with the desperate quality of someone who had reached the absolute limit of their ability to cope. And Derek, being the kind of person who could not ignore such things, even when common sense suggested he should turn toward the sound, and saw a figure stumbling along the edge of the flooded street, moving with the uncoordinated desperation of someone who had lost control of their basic motor functions. At first he thought it was just another casualty of the city's nightlife, someone who had overindulged and was now paying the price. But as he moved closer, fighting against the wind and rain, he realized 2 things simultaneously. First, that the figure was a woman, and second, that she was heading straight toward a construction site where the sidewalk had been torn up, leaving a gap protected only by flimsy orange barriers that the storm had already knocked aside. Derek did not think, he simply moved, covering the distance between them, with a speed born of pure instinct, and catching her arm just as she was about to step into the darkness, where the ground dropped away into a pit filled with water and construction debris, and the moment he touched her, she spun toward him with a gasp, her eyes wide and unfocused, and that was when recognition hit him like a physical blow. Because even drenched and disheveled, even with makeup running down her cheeks and the smell of expensive whiskey rolling off her in waves, he knew exactly who she was. Elizabeth Hartley, his boss, the woman who commanded boardrooms and made grown men nervous with a single glance, was currently leaning against him for support, unable to stand on her own, and looking at him with an expression that cycled between confusion, recognition, and something that might have been embarrassment if she had been sober enough to feel such sophisticated emotions. She tried to speak, her lips moving, but the words that came out were slurred beyond comprehension. Jumble of sounds that might have been thank you, or might have been leave me alone, or might have been something else entirely. And Derek realized that whatever had brought her to this state had taken her far past the point of rational decision, making, which meant that leaving her here was not an option, even though every instinct screamed at him that getting involved in the personal crisis of his boss was a spectacularly bad idea. He looked around, hoping to see a taxi, or better yet, someone from her actual social circle who could handle this situation with the appropriate level of discretion. But the streets were empty, the storm having driven everyone with sense indoors, and his apartment was only 2 blocks away. While trying to get her back to the office or find her home address would require explanations and phone calls that she almost certainly would not want him making, given her current condition. So Derek made a choice that he knew would complicate his life in ways he could not fully predict, and he slipped his arm around her waist, taking most of her weight, and began the slow, careful journey toward his apartment building. And she did not resist, instead, leaning into him with the trusting helplessness of someone who had given up trying to maintain control. And twice during that walk, she mumbled something that sounded like sorry, and each time Derek told her it was okay, even though he had no idea if it was. His apartment was exactly what you would expect from a mid-level employee who spent most of his time at work, small, functional, and decorated with the kind of generic furniture that came with the place, a far cry from what he imagined her world looked like, but it was warm and dry. And right now, that was all that mattered, and he guided her to the couch, where she collapsed with a sigh that seemed to come from somewhere deep in her soul, a sound of exhaustion that went beyond physical tiredness. Derek stood there for a moment, watching her, and feeling completely out of his depth, because this situation had not been covered in any employee handbook, and the Elizabeth Hartley he knew from work would never have allowed herself to be seen like this, vulnerable and imperfect and completely at someone else's mercy. And he wondered what had happened. What series of events had led to her drinking herself into this state and ending up alone on the streets during a storm? He got her water, and she drank it mechanically, her hands shaking slightly, and he found an old blanket and draped it over her because she was shivering, despite the warmth of the apartment. And he tried not to think about how different she looked like this, her usual armor of designer clothes and perfect makeup, stripped away, leaving someone who seemed smaller, somehow more human. She looked at him, then really looked at him, and for a moment her eyes cleared enough for him to see recognition and something else, something that made his breath catch, because it was the way someone looks at another person when they are seeing them, truly seeing them for the first time, without all the layers of social conditioning and professional hierarchy getting in the way. She reached out her hand, moving slowly, and touched his cheek, her fingers cold against his skin, and said something that he almost missed because she spoke so quietly. But he thought she said, "You are different from what I expected." And then, before he could ask what she meant, her eyes closed. Her hand dropped and she was asleep, the kind of sudden unconsciousness that comes from complete exhaustion. Derek sat in the chair across from the couch and watched her sleep, because he did not trust himself to do anything else, and did not trust that she would not wake up disoriented and afraid if he left the room. And as the storm continued to rage outside, he thought about all the moments over the past 3 years when he had caught her looking at him in the office, when he had felt that strange electricity in the air during their few direct interactions, when he had told himself he was imagining things, because why would someone like her ever notice someone like him? But now, sitting in his small apartment with her asleep, on his couch, her defenses completely down, he allowed himself to consider the possibility that maybe he had not been imagining things after all. Maybe there had been something there all along, simmering beneath the surface of their professional relationship, waiting for the right circumstances to reveal itself. He must have dozed off at some point, because when he woke up, the storm had passed, and pale morning light was filtering through the windows. And for a moment, he thought the entire night had been a dream, until he looked at the couch and saw the indentation where someone had been lying. Though Elizabeth herself was gone, Derek stood up quickly, his heart racing with a mixture of panic and disappointment, and he checked the bathroom and the small kitchen, but she was definitely gone, and he might have believed he had hallucinated the whole thing, except for two pieces of evidence that proved otherwise. The first was a lipstick mark on the edge of the water glass he had given her a perfect imprint of her lips in a shade of red that he recognized from seeing her wear it in the office. And the second was the smell that lingered in the apartment, a mixture of expensive perfume and whiskey that seemed to have soaked into the very air, creating a ghost of her presence that made the space feel different. Somehow charged with the memory of what had happened, Derek got ready for work, moving through his routine on autopilot and trying to figure out what the protocol was for this situation, because there was no way this would not be awkward, and he half expected to arrive at the office and find a termination notice waiting for him, because maybe she would decide that the easiest way to deal with the embarrassment was to remove the witness. But when he got to work, everything seemed normal. Elizabeth was in her office behind her glass walls, looking as polished and composed as ever, working through paperwork with the focused intensity that had helped her climb to the top of the corporate ladder. And she did not look at him, did not acknowledge his presence in any way, and Derek told himself that this was for the best, that they would both pretend the previous night had never happened and move on with their professional relationship, except he could not stop thinking about it, could not stop remembering the way she had looked at him, the way she had touched his face, the way she had seemed in that moment like someone who had been carrying a weight for too long and had finally been forced to set it down, and he caught himself watching her through the glass walls of her office, looking for some sign that she remembered that it had mattered, but her expression gave nothing away. The day passed in a blur of meetings and emails, and Derek stayed late again, partly because he had work to do, and partly because he was avoiding going home to the apartment that still smelled like her. And when he finally left the office building, the sun was setting, and the air had that crisp quality that comes after a storm, as if the world had been washed clean. He was halfway down the street when he saw her, and for a moment he thought he was hallucinating again, because there was no reason for Elizabeth Hartley to be standing on the sidewalk outside his apartment building. But there she was, wearing a different outfit than she had worn to the office. This one somehow more casual, though still expensive. And she was standing very still, staring at the building's entrance with an expression that he could not quite read. Derek approached slowly, his footsteps loud on the wet pavement, and she must have heard him because she turned and their eyes met, and he saw in that moment that she remembered everything, that she had come here deliberately, and that whatever was about to happen would change things in ways neither of them could predict. She opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, and he could see her gathering courage, could see her fighting against every instinct that told her this was a bad idea, that crossing this line would have consequences that neither of them might be ready for. And he waited because this had to be her choice, her decision about whether to acknowledge what had happened or let it fade into the realm of things they never spoke about. Finally, she said, "I wanted to thank you," and her voice was different from how it sounded in the office, less commanding, more uncertain, as if she had temporarily misplaced the confidence that usually armored her. And Derek nodded, because what else could he do, and said, "You are welcome." And for a moment they just stood there, two people separated by everything that society said should keep them apart, and yet somehow pulled together by forces neither fully understood. She looked at the building, then back at him, and said, "I do not usually let people see me like that." And there was something in the way she said it that made Derek understand. This was not just about the drinking or the storm, but about something deeper, about the carefully constructed walls she kept between herself and the rest of the world, and how he had somehow seen behind them. "I know," he said simply, and that seemed to be the right response, because something in her expression shifted, became less guarded, and she took a step closer to him, closing the physical distance that mirrored all the other distances between them, and said, "I have been standing here for 20 minutes trying to figure out what to say to you. You did not have to come." Derek said, even though he was glad she had, even though seeing her here felt like confirmation of something he had not dared to name. "I did," she insisted, and there was an intensity in her voice now, Conviction that made him believe her because I spent all day pretending last night did not happen, pretending that nothing had changed, and it was exhausting Derek, because something did change, at least for me. Derek felt his heart rate increase, felt the ground beneath him become less stable, because this was the moment where everything could go wrong, where he could misread the situation and destroy not just his career, but whatever fragile connection was forming between them. And yet he could not stop himself from asking what changed. She smiled then, but it was not her usual professional smile. It was something more vulnerable, more real. And she said, "I have spent 3 years watching you, Derek Walsh, watching the way you work, watching the way you treat people, watching the way you move through the world without demanding anything from it. And I told myself it was nothing, that I was just being observant. But last night, when I was at my absolute worst, when I had every reason to be angry and resentful, you were kind, and that is not something I encounter often in my world." Derek did not know what to say to that, because admitting that he had been equally aware of her, that he had spent those same 3 years trying not to think about her, trying not to imagine what it would be like if circumstances were different, felt too dangerous, too revealing. What happened last night, Derek asked instead, because he needed to understand what had brought her to that point, what had stripped away her usual control. She looked away, and he could see the struggle in her face, the debate about whether to trust him with the truth. And finally, she said, "I had a meeting with the board, and they made it very clear that there are limits to how far they are willing to let a woman climb in this company. And I was so angry, so frustrated, that I went to a bar and drank too much. And when I left, I just started walking, because I did not want to go home to my empty apartment and face the reality of my life. And you ended up in a storm," Derek said. "And you saved me," she corrected. And there was something in the way she said it that made it clear. She was not just talking about pulling her back from the construction pit. They stood there, in the fading light, and Derek felt the weight of the moment, felt all the reasons why this should not happen, why pursuing whatever was building between them was a terrible idea that could cost him his job, his stability, his carefully constructed life in the margins. And yet, looking at her, seeing the hope and fear and possibility in her eyes, he found himself saying, "Do you want to come up for coffee?" She laughed, and it was a real laugh, free from the calculated control she usually maintained, and said, "Coffee at 7 p.m., Derek, that is the worst excuse I have ever heard." "I know," he admitted, "but I could not think of anything better." She stepped closer still until there was almost no space between them, and said, "What if I do not want an excuse? What if I just want to see what happens when we stop pretending that there is nothing between us?" "Then I guess we find out," Derek said, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to break something open, because she reached out and took his hand, her fingers warm against his, and said, "I should warn you that I am terrible at this, that relationships and vulnerability and all of that are not things I have ever been good at. I am not exactly an expert myself," Derek admitted, "and my apartment still smells like whiskey and your perfume good," she said, "because I want to remember last night, want to remember that there was a moment when I was completely myself without any of the armor, and you did not run away." Derek led her into the building and up the stairs to his apartment, and as he unlocked the door, he thought about how 24 hours ago his life had been predictable and safe, and now he was about to step into territory that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Because sometimes the most important moments in life are the ones that happen by accident, the ones that you never plan for, but that change everything anyway. She stepped into his apartment and looked around with genuine curiosity, as if she was trying to understand him through his surroundings, and he watched her take in the modest furnishings, the books stacked on the coffee table, the single plant that he somehow managed to keep alive, and he waited for judgment, but instead she turned to him and said, "This feels like you. Is that good or bad?" he asked. "Neither," she said. "It just is, and that is more than I can say about most places I spend time." She moved to the window and looked out at the city lights, and Derek came to stand beside her, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth radiating from her body, and she said, "I have been thinking about what you must think of me showing up drunk on the street, letting you see me like that." "You are human," Derek said, "and I think maybe you do not get to be that very often." She turned to face him, and there were tears in her eyes now threatening to spill over, and she said, "No, I do not. And it is lonely, Derek, being the person everyone expects me to be, maintaining that image every single day, never letting anyone see the cracks. You do not have to maintain anything with me," he said. And it was both a promise and a risk, because he was giving her permission to be whoever she actually was, beneath all the expectations, and that meant he would have to do the same. She reached up and touched his face again. The same gesture from the night before, but this time she was sober. This time it was deliberate, and she said, "I do not know what this is, Derek, or where it goes, or how we navigate all the complications, but I know that I have not felt this seen by another person in longer than I can remember." They kissed then, and it was nothing like Derek had imagined during those moments when he had allowed himself to think about such things, because it was not passionate or dramatic. It was gentle and almost tentative, as if they were both afraid of breaking something fragile and precious. When they pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his and said, "This is going to be complicated." "Yes," Derek agreed. "People will talk. Probably. It might cost you your job. Might cost you more." She pulled back and looked at him seriously and said, "Would it be worth it?" Derek thought about his life before. Last night, about the safety of staying in the margins, about never reaching for anything that felt too big or too impossible. And then he looked at Elizabeth Hartley standing in his small apartment with tears still threatening to fall, looking at him like he was something valuable and rare, and he said, "Yes, I think it would." She smiled, then a real genuine smile that transformed her entire face, and said, "Then I guess we are doing this, whatever this is." They spent the rest of the evening talking, really talking in a way that neither of them did very often, sharing stories about their childhoods, their dreams, their fears. And Derek learned that Elizabeth had grown up poor, that she had fought for every advantage she had, that the armor she wore was not vanity but survival. And Elizabeth learned that Derek had chosen the margins deliberately, that he had grown up watching his father chase success and lose himself in the process, that for Derek staying small had been a form of self-protection. Somewhere around midnight, as they sat on his couch with her shoes kicked off and her head resting on his shoulder, Elizabeth said, "What if we did not have to be the people we have been? What if we could choose differently? What would that look like?" Derek asked. She thought about it and said, "For me it would mean stop pretending. I do not need anyone being honest about what I want, even when it is scary. And for you, for me it would mean stop hiding." Derek said, "Stop accepting less than I deserve, because I am afraid of being noticed." They fell asleep on the couch, still dressed, still talking. And when Derek woke up in the morning, she was still there, and that felt like its own kind of miracle, because she had not run away, had not decided in the harsh light of day that this was a mistake. Over the following weeks, they navigated the complications together, sometimes gracefully, and sometimes not, because dating your boss is inherently messy. And there were rules about workplace relationships, and there was gossip that spread through the office like wildfire. And there were moments when Derek wondered if they had made a terrible mistake. But there were also moments of startling clarity, like when Elizabeth stood up in a board meeting and advocated for Derek's promotion despite the optics, despite what people would say, because she said quietly afterwards that loving someone meant wanting them to grow, not keeping them small to make yourself comfortable. And there were moments like when Derek held her while she cried after another bruising encounter with executives who could not see past their own biases, and he reminded her that being strong did not mean never breaking. It meant being willing to break and trust that someone would be there to help you put yourself back together. 6 months after that stormy night, Derek stood in Elizabeth's actual apartment, a space that was as polished and perfect as his was humble, and he watched her move around the kitchen making dinner. And he thought about how strange life was, how the most important things often happen by accident, how one choice to help someone in distress could cascade into something that reshaped your entire understanding of what was possible. She caught him staring and raised an eyebrow and said, "What are you thinking about?" "You," Derek said honestly. "I am thinking about how you came and found me the morning after, how you stood outside my building gathering courage. She came over and wrapped her arms around him and said, "I was terrified that you would reject me, that I had imagined everything, that I had ruined things by being vulnerable." And now he asked. Now she said, pulling back to look at him, "I cannot imagine not being vulnerable with you, cannot. Imagine going back to the person I was before." Derek kissed her and thought about all the versions of himself he had been over the years, the one who stayed small, the one who avoided risk, the one who had convinced himself that some things were simply not meant for people like him. And he was grateful to that Derek for surviving, for persisting, but he was also glad to leave him behind. Because here is what Derek had learned: sometimes the storms that seem like they are destroying everything are actually clearing space for something new, and sometimes saving someone else means giving yourself permission to be saved, and sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is not crossing the line, but refusing to admit that the line is already gone, that your heart made its choice long before your head caught up. Elizabeth had returned to the living room with 2 glasses of wine, and she handed him one and said, "I have been thinking about something." "What is that?" Derek asked. She took a sip of her wine and said, "What if I step down from my position?" Derek stared at her and said, "What? Why would you do that?" "Because," she said, "I am tired of fighting battles that never end. And because I have been offered a consulting position that would give me more freedom. And because maybe I am ready to choose my own happiness over everyone else's expectations." "And this has nothing to do with us?" Derek asked carefully. "Because I do not want to be the reason you give up your career." She laughed and said, "Derek, my career has been eating me alive for years. You did not cause that, you just helped me see it, and besides, this is not giving up, it is choosing differently." They talked late into the night about possibilities, about what their lives could look like if they stopped living according to other people's scripts. And by the time Derek left her apartment, they had made plans, tentative but real, about building something together. Not just a relationship, but a life. And when Derek walked home, through the city streets, he thought about that night 6 months ago, when he had stumbled upon a drunken woman in a storm, and made the choice to help her, not knowing that it would lead here, not knowing that one act of basic human kindness would become the hinge on which his entire life turned. He thought about the lipstick mark she had left behind, and how he had kept that glass unwashed for a week afterward, because it felt like proof that something extraordinary had happened. And he thought about how she had stood outside his building, gathering courage to take a chance on something unpredictable and precious. And Derek Walsh, who had spent so much of his life convinced that he did not belong in the world of bright lights and big moments, finally understood that belonging was not something you earned or deserved. It was something you chose by being brave enough to show up as yourself, by being willing to be seen fully and completely by another person, even when it scared you, especially. When it scared you, the storm had passed, but what it left behind was better than what had been there before. Because sometimes destruction is not an ending. It is an invitation to begin again, to build something new on the cleared ground. And sometimes, the people who seem the most untouchable are the ones who most desperately need someone to reach out and remind them that they do not have to weather every storm alone. And in the end, that was the real story. Not about a boss and an employee or about crossing professional lines, but about 2 people who had been living half-lives, finding each other in a moment of crisis and choosing, despite all the reasons not to try to build something whole together, to risk everything comfortable and safe for the possibility of something real.